It was the kind of night where the fog was so thick that you could barely see a few feet in front of you. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, swallowing up every sound and sense of reason. I was driving back home from a late shift, trying to cut across the back roads to save some time. I should have known better. Those roads can play tricks on you, especially on nights like this. But I was tired, eager to get home, and my tank was running dangerously low. I finally spotted a gas station up ahead, one of those old run-down places that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. I pulled in, my car sputtering as I rolled to a stop next to the pumps. The flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow across the cracked pavement, and the place was dead silent, except for the occasional buzz of the lights. I got out, shivering as a cold, damp breeze cut through my jacket. The chill wasn't just from the wind. It was that kind of cold that sinks into your bones, makes you feel like you're not alone. I checked my phone, hoping to call someone and let them know I'd be late. Of course, there was no signal, just the dreaded red battery icon taunting me. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should try to find someone inside or just grab the gas and hope for the best. That's when I saw him. A figure was walking out of the fog, slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. He was tall, a bit too lanky, with a long, dark coat that seemed to blend into the night. I couldn't make out his face, just the vague shape of it, obscured by the mist and shadows. I don't know why, but the sight of him sent a chill down my spine. As he got closer, I could see something metallic glinting in his hand. For a second, I thought it was a knife, but as he moved closer to the light, I saw it was a gas can, a rusty, dented old thing that looked like it had been dragged out from under a pile of junk. He stopped a few feet away from me, tilting his head like he was studying me. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice raspy and low, barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the empty lot like a shout. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe it was the smile that followed, thin and unsettling. But everything inside me screamed to get back in the car. Yeah, I think I ran out of gas," I stammered, trying to sound calm, but my voice was shaking. The man took another step closer, and I finally got a good look at his face. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they were locked onto mine, unblinking. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, like they didn't quite fit right in his mouth. He lifted the gas can a little, like he was showing it off. "No problem," he said. "I've got some right here. Let me help you." Everything about this was wrong. The way he was standing there, the way he was looking at me. It felt like I was a mouse cornered by a cat. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, that's okay," I said. "I can handle it. I'll call someone to come get me." For a moment his smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed. "No need for that," he said, his voice suddenly sharper, colder. "I'm here. I can help you right now." He took another step forward, and I could see his hands, bony and pale, gripping the handle of the gas can a little too tightly. That's when the fear really hit me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, telling me to move, to get back in the car and drive, even if it meant pushing the damn thing. I turned, fumbling for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them out of my pocket. I managed to unlock the door and practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as I heard his laugh. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost like a hiss. But it echoed across the lot, cutting through the fog. I scrambled to lock the doors, my hands slipping over the buttons in my panic. I could barely breathe, my fingers trembling as I finally managed to hit the lock. I looked up, expecting to see him standing right there, maybe with that awful smile plastered on his face, but he was gone. Just gone. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around the gas station like it was trying to swallow it whole, and there was no sign of him anywhere. For a few seconds I just sat there, clutching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I kept telling myself to calm down, that it was just some weird guy trying to help, and I was overreacting, but I knew deep down that wasn't it. I started the car, praying it would hold out just a little longer, and slowly pulled away from the pump. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave, but the parking lot was empty. I was almost out of the lot when I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I looked back, and there he was, standing by the pumps, holding the gas can, his face just barely visible in the dim light. I don't know how he got there so fast, but he was just staring at me, his head tilted, that same unsettling smile on his lips. I floored it, the car lurching forward as I sped out of there, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving, even when the fog started to clear, even when the road was empty, and I could see the lights of the next town up ahead. I don't know what would have happened if I'd let him help me. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night and the fog rolls in, I can't help but think about that gas station and that man and the way he smiled at me like he knew something I didn't. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next person who's desperate enough to stop. I always thought working the night shift at the gas station would be easy money. My name's Mark, and like most college students, I needed to make some extra cash over the summer. Graveyard shift, they called it. Sounded ominous, but mostly it just meant long hours of boredom, a lot of cleaning, and the occasional trucker passing through looking for a caffeine fix. It was a quiet job, a little too quiet. Most nights I'd zone out, lost in my own thoughts, lulled by the hum of the fridges and the distant chirping of crickets. That night was no different. It was slow, even for a weeknight. I was wiping down the counter, trying to stay awake, when I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I glanced up to see an old, beat-up pickup truck rolling up to the pumps, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Something about that truck set off alarms in my head, but I couldn't quite place it. I shook off the feeling and watched as the driver climbed out. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a weathered face that looked like it had seen more years than it should have. His eyes were a piercing blue, almost too bright, and they locked on to me as soon as he stepped out of the truck. He had this way of staring, like he could see right through me, and I could feel my stomach twist a little. "Fill it up," he said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping against metal. I nodded, grabbed the pump, and headed outside. The night air was cool, but I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried not to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my neck. As I started to pump the gas, I glanced up. He was still staring, his eyes unblinking, his face expressionless. I could feel a bead of sweat trickle down my back, and I had this sudden irrational urge to drop everything and run. But I didn't. I couldn't. I finished filling the tank, put the pump back, and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped back in, and I heard it again a few seconds later as the old man followed me. I felt a knot in my throat, but I tried to act normal. "That'll be $20, I said, my voice a little shakier than I'd intended. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept staring at me, those icy blue eyes boring into mine. Finally, He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. When he handed it to me, his fingers brushed against mine, and I felt a cold, electric shock run up my arm. It was like touching ice, but worse, like something had latched onto me, something dark and hungry. I yanked my hand back, and the bill slipped out of my grasp, landing on the counter. The old man just chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Something wrong, son?" he asked, his voice calm but with a strange edge to it, like he was enjoying this. I forced a smile, but it must have looked more like a grimace. "No, sir, just tired, I guess," I managed, avoiding his gaze. I reached down to pick up the bill, but when I looked at his hand again, my heart skipped a beat. His fingers, they looked longer, like they'd stretched out somehow, and his nails were thicker, almost claw-like. I blinked, and they were normal again, but I couldn't shake the image. He saw the confusion on my face, and he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice low and almost mocking. "Maybe you have." I didn't know what to say. I just wanted him to leave, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. He picked up the 20, still smiling, and stuffed it back into his pocket. "Get some rest, son," he said, and there was something in his tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You never know what might come crawling out of the dark. With that, he turned and walked out, the bell clanging behind him. I stood there, frozen, watching as he climbed into his truck and drove off. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I managed to shake off the paralysis, and I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the night shift was getting to me. But when I went to lock up for the night, I noticed something strange. There was a dark, greasy smudge on the counter where the old man had touched it. I wiped it with a cloth, but it didn't come off. It just smeared, like some kind of oil. I finished my shift, went home, and tried to forget about it. But the next night, when I showed up for work, the truck was back, parked in the exact same spot, headlights off, engine silent. I stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was a local, or maybe he'd just forgotten something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and waited. Hours passed, but the truck didn't move. Around 2 a.m., I finally gathered up the courage to step outside. I approached the truck, slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. When I reached the driver's side, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I told myself to just open the door, just to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. But before I could move, the window rolled down, and I found myself staring into those cold, blue eyes again. "Working late, son," he said, and his voice was softer this time, almost a whisper. I tried to back away, but I couldn't. It was like my feet were glued to the ground. "I told you to get some rest," he continued, his lips curling into that same unsettling smile. "You didn't listen." Before I could respond, he leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "You should have listened," he hissed, and his face began to change. His skin grew pale and thin, his eyes darkened, and his mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the floor inside the station, the sun just starting to rise. The truck was gone, and there was no sign of the old man. But there was something else, a dark, oily handprint on the inside of the glass door, like he'd been watching me all night. I quit the next day. Never went back, never looked at another gas station the same way again. But every now and then when I'm driving alone at night, I see a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, and I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. I don't know who he was, or what he was, but I know one thing. He's still out there, waiting, and one night he's going to come back for me. I never thought I'd find myself stranded on a deserted highway in the middle of a storm, but there I was, gripping the steering wheel, squinting through the torrential downpour as Emily tried to navigate us through the darkness. We had been driving for hours, and the GPS signal had cut out miles ago. I was beginning to think we'd never make it home, when the car suddenly jolted and a loud thud echoed from the rear. My heart sank. A flat tire. Perfect. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to stay calm as the wind howled around us, shaking the car. "We can't change it out here," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the storm. She was right. The rain was so thick, I could barely see my hand in front of my face, let alone a tire iron. I saw it then, through the sheets of rain, a faint, flickering light. A gas station, just a little way up the road. It looked old, dilapidated, like it hadn't seen a customer in decades. But it was shelter, and maybe, just maybe, someone could help us. We parked in the gravel lot and made a run for the building, our clothes soaked through by the time we reached the awning. The place was almost pitch dark, the only light coming from a flickering fluorescent bulb. It buzzed loudly, cutting in and out, casting strange, jittery shadows that made the place feel even more unsettling. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle, but Emily was already inside. I followed her, stepping into the stale, humid air. The inside of the station was even worse than it looked, from the outside. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with products that looked long expired. The place reeked of something I couldn't quite place. A mix of stale coffee, mold, and something else. Something that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty space. Emily clung to my arm, her eyes darting around nervously. Then, from behind the counter, I saw movement. A figure shuffled forward, stepping into the dim light. It was an old woman, her face hidden in the shadows, except for her eyes. They seemed to glow, reflecting the pale light from the bulb overhead. "Help you?" she rasped, her voice low and scratchy, like dry leaves on pavement. I explained our situation, and Emily nodded along, her fingers trembling as she clutched my arm. "Phone's dead," I said, showing her my phone. "No signal out here." The old woman just stared at us, her glowing eyes unblinking. Finally, she nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "You can use the phone in the back," she said, her lips curling into a strange, crooked smile. "But it's 25 cents a minute." I hesitated. Something about her smile made my stomach twist, but we didn't have much choice. I pulled out some coins and handed them over. She gestured to a door behind the counter. "Through there," she whispered, her voice barely more than a hiss. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room on the other side was tiny, barely big enough for the old payphone that hung on the wall and a rickety chair in the corner. I stepped inside, and Emily followed, the door swinging shut behind us. I tried the phone, dropping a quarter into the slot and dialing. Nothing. Just static. I tried again, and again, but it was no use. The line was dead. I was about to tell Emily we'd have to try something else when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the walls. I froze, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening as the sound grew louder, angrier. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't answer. I didn't know. Then the growling was joined by something else, a slow, rhythmic thudding, like heavy footsteps. They circled the building, moving closer, and then stopping, right outside the door. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. "Hey!" I yelled, banging on the door. "Let us out of here!" But there was no response, only the howling wind and the faint, persistent growling outside. Emily started to cry. Her sobs muffled as she buried her face in my shoulder. I tried to comfort her, but I was terrified, too. We were trapped. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. The storm outside raged on, and the creature, whatever it was, continued to circle the building, its growls growing louder, more frantic. I could hear its claws scraping against the walls, as if it was trying to find a way in. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. I banged on the door again, screaming for help, but no one answered. The growling only got louder, as if mocking me. I began to wonder if we'd ever get out of there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the growling stopped. Silence descended over the station, heavy and suffocating. The storm had passed, and the first rays of dawn were starting to seep through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I reached for the door handle, my hands shaking, and turned it slowly. This time it opened without resistance. We stepped out into the main room, and my heart nearly stopped. The old woman was gone, and so was the counter she'd been standing behind. The room looked different, too. Cleaner, somehow, as if it had been freshly scrubbed. I turned to Emily, but she just shook her head, as confused as I was. We stumbled outside, into the cold, damp morning air. Our car was still there, sitting in the gravel lot, but the flat tire was gone. I walked around to check it, my hands shaking, and found that it had been replaced with a brand new one. I didn't know what to think. I still don't. We got in the car, and I drove, not caring where, as long as it was away from that place. We didn't say a word to each other, just sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never did. I don't know what we encountered at that gas station, or what was circling the building that night. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that growling, low and angry, somewhere far off in the distance.